Hello there. I'm the Reverend Shane Montoya, the interim pastor of the Wolcott Congregational Church, and I'm glad you're here for another segment in our Together Apart worship series. As always, I hope if you haven't already to check out the links in the video description for the worship guide that should give you some nice prayers, readings, and songs to sing along to that fit with the themes of this worship sermon. It may be the devil, or it may be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. That's Bob Dylan from the song, You Gotta Serve Somebody. When I was in high school, I absolutely loved Bob Dylan. From The Times They Are A-Changin' to Blood on the Tracks, from Blowin' in the Wind to Tangled Up in Blue, I devoured Dylan's music and his poetry. Indeed, I would say that I listened to it with an almost religious devotion. I actually remember writing my first self-directed academic research paper on All Along the Watchtower, which, although was performed by Jimi Hendrix and popularized by him, was actually first written and performed by Bob Dylan. But there was one song that I didn't really understand, and yet still resonated with me. Perhaps I was still too young to understand You Gotta Serve Somebody. Maybe it was because I wasn't a Christian, or perhaps I was in a stage in my life in which I didn't really get funk, soul, and gospel, the three musical genres that the song borrows the most from. But the older I get and the more I consider it, the more I believe that that song, Gotta Serve Somebody, is as true as and relevant as any of Dylan's more beloved songs, and it speaks to a deeply Christian and human truth. This truth is one that echoes a theme that runs throughout the New Testament. Know who you serve and who you belong to, because you do serve someone, whether you like it or not. Gotta Serve Somebody is not an obscure song. It won a Grammy back in 1979, and I have learned that it was Bob Dylan's last top 40 hit. It is the most popular song that came out of the period in Dylan's life in which he identified as a Christian, and it is a simultaneously funky and haunting reminder not only of the stakes of our faith, but that all of us, from the most powerful to the most lowly, owe our obedience to something, or in Dylan's words, to someone. This is a theme that runs throughout the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount that people cannot serve God and wealth. It's Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. And it's a theme that's picked up by Paul in our reading today. Before we continue any further, I would like to acknowledge that Paul's language of slavery in this passage and elsewhere is and has been troubling for many Christians, especially Christians who were enslaved or who fought against slavery, Christians whose ancestors were enslaved, and for those who live today with those legacies of slavery. The Apostle Paul's language around slavery might be characterized at best as complicated, and at its worst, his seeming non-condemnation of the practice has been used, and I've come to find out is still used in some quarters today as a justification for slavery. For my part, I believe it is our duty as a Christian church to know our past, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to be reminded regularly that the core of the gospel is liberation and freedom, not slavery. Indeed, I believe that any proclamation of the gospel that encourages slavery is a false gospel, as the core of the gospel is liberation and freedom. And this is a liberation and freedom that all people are invited to take part in. Paul himself reminds us of this in his second letter to the Corinthians. I will read from the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 3, verses 15 through 18. Indeed, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. In interpreting our scripture today from the book of Romans, the United Church of Christ pastor, the Reverend Dr. Shanthia Moore, notes that Paul's usage of the language of slavery is probably best understood as a cultural shorthand or a metaphor, the same way that I can talk about baseball to get a point across. The grim reality that people in Paul's day accepted and knew was that a slaveholder would have almost complete control over the life and destiny of a slave. And that slaves were, or at least were thought to be, completely subordinated to the master in heart, action, and will. So this is a messy metaphor, and it only really works as a gospel message. That is, that it points towards God's love in Jesus Christ and towards our liberation and salvation, if we remember that the Apostle Paul, just as for Bob Dylan, thought that we all already do serve somebody. Paul emphasizes the stark choice available to us: sin or righteousness, death or life. Dylan, for his part, emphasizes that this reality extends to people of all classes, genders, races, and ages. And if we accept this even as partly true, then our gospel message of liberation, freedom, and salvation must not come from denying that we have a Lord, for everyone does, but from the acknowledgement of Jesus Christ as Lord, following the path of righteousness that Jesus Christ laid out for us in his birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection. We are reminded as well that Jesus does have a yoke, and that being a Christian is not, or at least it shouldn't be, a consequence-free act. There is a cost to discipleship. The road is often narrow and full of dangers. This journey will, or at least it should, change us. But Jesus also tells us that ultimately his burden is light, especially compared to the yoke of sin. A life of anger, of jealousy, of greed, that cares only selfishly and never loves selflessly is a burdensome one. And it is a life that is not truly free. So I will leave us today with this most ancient of faith statements, the Creed before the creeds, which says in 3 words what I struggle to say in 1,000. Jesus is Lord. That Jesus is Lord has been a core of the faith for millions of enslaved Christians throughout history. And it should ring in our souls as well, too. For with apologies to both the Apostle Paul and to Bob Dylan, if we got to serve somebody, then let's make sure that it's the Lord of life, the Liberator, the God who saves. Amen.